All right, moving along with our video lectures on chapters 2 through 6, looking at early civilizations and societies. Next, we're going to look at Oceania. Remember, Oceania includes all these small islands in the Pacific Ocean, also known as the Pacific Islands, as well as the countries of Australia and New Zealand. Now, the people that inhabit these Pacific Islands are generally called the Austronesians. And what unites them is that they all speak a similar language, right? Or their language comes from a similar source, kind of like how the Indo-Europeans, whether they went to Europe or to China or to India, also share a similar trace of language. So in Oceania, we see that over thousands of years, people slowly start making their way across from island to island, and eventually settling down in different islands. So they share kind of not only a similar language, a similar culture as well. And this was probably made possible during the last ice age. So similar how the people who eventually made their way to the Americas and settled down in the Americas walked over, lower ice or lower sea levels. The same thing probably happened here in Oceania, where the distance between the islands were nowhere near as far as they are now, and they were able to settle down. Now, we also know that besides traveling from Southeast Asia and making their way across into the Pacific Ocean, there's some Austronesians that actually went westward and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and made their way to Madagascar. So there's some people in Madagascar who speak a language that is very similar to the languages spoken in places like Hawaii or Easter Island or Fiji, all these Pacific Island people, or Samoa. Now, the people that settled these islands, they were most of them were hunter gatherers, but some places agriculture developed, and that kind of tells us how the idea of agriculture wasn't always spread, by people. Sometimes in some societies developed agriculture or went through the Neolithic Revolution completely independently and on their own. So, for example, in Papua New Guinea, which is a big island on top of Australia, they had farming and they were pastoralists. But in Australia, they remained hunter gatherers, and the original people, or the native people, or the indigenous people of Australia, they're called Aboriginals, right? That you see here, and many of them still live in a hunter gatherer type of way of life. Now, one of the things that allowed these Austronesians to travel across, parts of the Pacific Ocean, is that they developed a special canoe called a double hull canoe that we see here. Double hull meaning that there's two canoes kind of attached together. And with this sailing, with this sail, they were able to move across long distances with limited supply. So why were people moving from island to island, right, further and further and further away from their, origins? And it's all about population, right? Just like Paleolithic humans moved, across the world, because as their population grew, their, resources became limited. Same thing happened with all these little islands, right? All these little islands you see here, right? So people started moving away and looking for a new island to settle when the population was simply too much for one island. Now, going back to those that went to Madagascar, one of the unique things about them is that they bring with them other animals that they've domesticated, like the pig and the chicken. They also bring taro root with them that you see down here, and the bananas as well. And that's why eventually bananas makes its way across the African continent. It becomes a very important crop there. So it was people, sailing from Southeast Asia, sailing from this region over here, across the Indian Ocean, bringing bananas and pigs and chickens, and eventually those will spread across, the African continent. Now, one of the most unique places that you see all in this corner over here is Easter Island. And what happens here is kind of like a warning sign of bad things that can happen. They built these huge statues that were representative of their ancestor god, very similar to the statues that we saw with the Olmecs. And they started their population started growing, right? Because they brought farming with them, and then eventually they would, cut down the forest, cut down the trees to make room for crops and for, to grow crops for farmland. But eventually, their population was so high that there wasn't enough food to, to feed everyone. So we start seeing is the development of cannibalism on Easter Island, and eventually the population had to drop from there until it was low enough that the island itself can provide enough food. So we, desperate times calls for desperate measures, and we see cannibalism becoming a thing, and this is partly a result of overpopulation and deforestation. All right, the other region we're going to look at is sub-Saharan Africa. Now, one thing we need to know about sub-Saharan Africa is that there's, Africa's this huge, huge continent, and people have lived there since forever. And where they live within Africa has a strong influence in the way they, in their lifestyles. Right. So we have, of course, the Sahara Desert in the north. There's also deserts in different parts of Africa. We have the rainforest, the jungle in the central part, and then we have the savanna, the Sahel, which is plains all across most of Africa. So when we again, I think we mentioned this when we were looking at maps, right? We have North Africa, the region, and then we have all the other regions that are oftentimes grouped as sub-Saharan Africa. That we need to know this differentiation as well. Now, throughout Africa, they have many societies that remained hunter-gatherers, just like their ancestors, back in the Paleolithic era, and they never settled down or developed agriculture. Then in places like Egypt and North Africa, they were completely agricultural and pastoral, and formed, their tremendous civilization there. Some people use farming in Africa, and we find these in different, all over the continent. So you see small farming villages pop up here and there as well. Some people became pastoralists, right? And cattle was one of their main crops, right? Here we see some cows, right? Cattle. We also see pastoralists in North Africa because they domesticated the camel, which allowed them to survive and travel across the desert. And some of them even became merchants that crossed the desert looking for gold and other luxury goods. Now, one thing we need to mention, one group that's important is the Bantu migrations. So just like how the Austronesians spread their culture, their language, agriculture, and domesticated animals across the Pacific Islands, the same thing will happen with the Bantus. Now, the Bantus came right from here, kind of like this western central part of Africa, right in the middle, and they started migrating over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Right, they migrated south and then migrated to the east, right, and then to the southeast. And the reason we know this, right, even though they didn't have any written records, is because of their language, right? The Bantus is a ethno-linguistic group, meaning they all speak a similar language, just like the Indo-Europeans, just like the Austronesians. And that means that all these different tribes and civilizations and kingdoms that eventually form in this, huge part of sub-Saharan Africa, many of them will share a common linguistic, heritage. Top of that, these migrations are very slow, again, over hundreds and hundreds of years. So it wasn't like an invasion, just like the Aryans migrated to India. That was not an invasion. It was a slow migration. With them, they spread foods, they spread crops because these people were agriculturalists. So they would have, for example, sorghum, they see here, or millet, I should say. This is sorghum down here. Sweet potatoes or yams, right? And all these crops they brought with them, and they spread the cultivation of these crops wherever it is that they moved throughout sub-Saharan Africa. We also know that the Bantus developed iron metallurgy, right? So they're making weapons and tools out of iron, which is much more durable, much more stronger, much more longer lasting than bronze. and or even stone tools. So these iron, wielding Bantus, they were easily able to defeat any tribe that rose up against them because they had a technological advantage. And on top of that, with iron tools, they were able to produce a greater amount of food surplus, which increased their population and continued kind of like fueling these migrations across Africa, right? So they spread the use of this technology, right? Here we see kind of like a blacksmith working with the metal. Now, the Bantus, like I mentioned before, they share a similar language, but they also share similar religious beliefs. They are animists, meaning that they believe that there are spirits everywhere, including like rivers and forests and trees and the water. They believe in ancestral worship, right, where they pray to their ancestors for assistance and help. But they also believe in a supreme deity, a supreme God, a creator God that created everything. But they also have dozens and dozens of other minor gods that you can try to pray to. We know a lot about their masks. Right, they would design these very elaborate masks. The belief was that by wearing these masks, you were able to harness the power of your ancestors, or you're able to ward off evil spirits from doing you and your family harm. Their music and their dance was also an important part of their worship. So we see a lot of mixing of religion with music and with art in the form of these masks. And that's it for the Bantus. All right, see you next time.